Okay, thank you very much. Hello, my name's Denis Treacy. I head Culture Compass Limited, but I spent 40 years in supply chain in food manufacturing. I was president of quality, safety, security and environment across the global Pladis business. So 34 factories, 13 countries, 4 billion consumers, 26,000 employees. So a huge network, 1,500 suppliers, and making sure that we were able to produce safely and effectively across that whole of geography. So I'm bringing that experience today to share with you all.
Fantastic. Gideon?
Gideon Ashworth, Head of Food Defence for Bart Ingredients. My current role involves looking at the technical aspects of supply chain across the globe. So, as I describe it, it's everything technical but our own factories. That's the best way to sum things up in a short.
Very good, very good. And Daniel, you're not a food defence specialist. You're an IT specialist. What can you give us a bit about your background?
Yeah, so I'm the group head of IT here at Graham's Family Dairy. We're a family-run business, started in 1939, and we produce milk and dairy products across the UK, primarily in Scotland, to the tune of £120 million a year. So we're that sort of verging on sort of the upper end of the mid-sized market. So supply chain I deal with very heavily in terms of integration and IT. From the food defence side, not so much, but hopefully I can give you some sort of insight as to what I do.
Wonderful. And finally, Gary. Oh, Gary, I can't seem to hear you. You're not on. Is that better? What I tell you what, I'll just explain. Gary is joining us from the States. He's a senior director of food safety and contamination prevention from WorldAware. So just whilst we get Gary's sound, that's Gary's background. I'll come back to you, Gary, and hopefully we'll get your sound in a bit. Just to double check, Gary, you can hear us okay? Okay. Well, if you could fiddle around with your microphone, I'll just do the questions and come back to you. Fantastic. So this wonderful topic of food defense. Before we get into understanding how the supply chain is threatened and security integration will give us operational success. Nice nebulous question, Denis. What exactly does effective supply chain management look like for you? Before we get into the nitty gritty, let's frame it.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so. My 40 years of experience has taught me that there are 4 absolute fundamental principles to ensuring that you understand and you manage your supply chain. The first thing is strategy. Every business has got to have a strategy that involves not only its policies, rules, standards, whatever integrated systems it wants, but also how it intends to do business and what it believes its opportunities are. The next thing is performance, what we measure. So it ranges from things like information data, indicators, targets, observations, feedback, assessments, audits, whatever that may be. However you determine whether your performance is effective or not. The third thing is organisation, structure, authority, credibility, responsibility. Who's the level of competence, capability and maturity of any business. And the final one, and the one I think everyone feels topical at the moment, is culture. Culture is absolutely leadership. It's the values that you determine at the start within your strategy, how you think, what your relationships are, behaviours, motivation, conduct and accountability. Those 4 things are what I call supply chain risk in balance. You get those 4 things in balance, you have a well-structured supply chain. Any one of those that's out of balance basically sub-optimizes your capabilities. Okay.
Okay, no, fantastic, and we'll get onto some of those things, bringing it out of balance
Sure.
shortly. Gideon, does that resonate for you? A nice framing of supply chain best practice, or is there another angle we could sort of frame it in?
Absolutely. I think that's a very good summary of what we do. From day to day, obviously, we have to drill down into the finer details of all those aspects, and especially at the moment, I know we're going to be coming on to that, but it is throwing up challenges, which are both very exciting and also quite concerning. So, we have in Bart, we have a very strong food defence strategy, as Denis was referring to, and we are adhering to that even through these challenging times.
Okay, fantastic. Good to hear. Daniel, from perhaps a cyber side or an IT side, what does your contribution sort of mean to the operational success of Graham's Dairy?
Or the challenges we face are with a wealth of different suppliers is making sure we're getting that data fully integrated, so that we're not suddenly going, oh, it's okay, we bought 10 million pots for ice cream last September, that'll last us for ages, and then all of a sudden you run out, or you discover that in the current times, most of our products are produced locally, most of our ingredients are locally sourced, but you'll have the occasional thing like pineapple chunks for cottage cheese that are imported from Spain. And if we're not getting that full understanding of where everything's coming from, the full availability of these products, what the distribution network is like for them, then we fall down, and that's the problem.
Definitely, and we'll get into some of the ways. There's a lot of cyber threats as well to the current climate. Gary, do we have your audio now?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, fantastic. Nice.
Wonderful.
Yes. How are you doing? Welcome. You're in the East Coast?
Yes, of Maryland. We're sequestered, quarantined at home, so I've got my comfortable at home work shirt on.
Perfect. Well, I don't use this as my comfy wear. Don't worry. So supply chain best practice. Let's before we look into lots of facets of where it can go awry, and there's a lot of that in this conference. What does best practice mean for you?
Well, part of my perspective comes from working at FDA during the time when the Food Safety Modernization Act was being developed. And from that point on, supply chain is a critical part of complying with the Preventive Controls Rule for human and animal food. And added to that, the Foreign Supplier Verification Program is a requirement. And so from that standpoint, I look at it from that foundation, what's expected from the regulatory side. And that's all hazard and risk-based from the big picture perspective. And then from that point on, I have been involved in when I retired from FDA, a number of legal cases where I could see inside where supply chain failures led to issues for a company unexpectedly. A good example was a situation where somebody ran out of a particular frozen vegetable, and outside of the contractual relationship and all of the COA information required, they supplemented their supply from an unapproved supplier, and it led to a lot of issues that ultimately a big recall. So sometimes it's hard to ensure that your key suppliers, your select suppliers, they need to know if they can't supply it, don't go outside the network to find it. And that was just one example of what can happen sometimes when people get short of supply. And it worries me a little bit in this context during this time, if somebody's getting short of supply, might they feel a little tempted to reach further beyond their comfort level to get supply that could lead to problems.
No, that is a dark thought. Well, let's stay with you, Gary, then, and then work back the other way on my screen. So it sounds like just-in-time delivery plays quite a critical role in the food and beverage industry. Is it under threat? I mean, we hear it in the news that it might be, but is it?
It seems at this point in time it's not, but we do hear that a number of companies have employees who are concerned about their health and well-being and the social distancing issues, and so perhaps their employees, the numbers are down, and that could result in a ripple effect that perhaps some supply ingredients might be cut short a little bit. Another aspect of just-in-time that we've seen in WorldAware that has created an issue, we import a lot of meat products from other countries, and those products have to be re-inspected by the USDA. And sometimes because of the just-in-time and sort of the pressure to keep production going, this is prior to COVID, people didn't double check to see whether that product had been re-inspected. And when it turned out it wasn't, all of the products that were made with that imported meat, even though it was probably perfectly safe, had to be recalled because they had this rush, they got it in, it's fresh, but they didn't really check the paperwork, and that led to a big problem. So if just-in-time correlates with being in a rush and not following the rules and dotting I's and crossing T's, it can lead to problems down the road.
Okay, well, Daniel, is just-in-time an issue for you from an IT perspective? Are your IT suppliers changing how they operate?
No, I think within the dairy, the only real just-in-time ordering we do is for our milk bottles, and that's primarily from a physical space point of view. So the bottle plant that we order the bottles from is only about 2 or 3 miles down the road, so it's not a major concern for us. From an IT point of view, we have had everything is just in time in IT, isn't it? It's last minute. But there have been delays, absolutely. Nothing that's really impacted our business, but the crisis around sort of this rush to get home working and everyone's got headsets and things like that, that has caused challenges. But generally, as a rule, it's not a problem.
Okay, but I'm sure the home working challenge is really ringing a bell for everybody because we're all working from home.
You cannot buy webcams in the UK for love nor money at the moment.
Mine, I ordered it in March. It said congratulations, it will arrive in June. But no, Gideon, just-in-time delivery, is this a red herring in the newspapers, or is it truly a problem?
I wouldn't say it's a problem, and I do want to mention the other potential crisis we've had recently, which is Brexit. And in my opinion, Brexit has trained us to cope with supply shortages. So Bart, as a lot of other companies, overstocked for the more than one Brexit date we were due for. So in that sense, it did train us, and it trained us to communicate for these potential supply issues. So I think that's a positive outcome. It is just-in-time delivery is very important, especially when you're looking at global supply chains. You're looking at lead times of 4 weeks, 6 weeks. We are being affected because the demand for our ingredients has increased so much since the lockdown has been enforced. So just-in-time is now that's getting squeezed. So there's potential supply issues coming out of source countries such as India. They're on lockdown as well. Now, whilst they might be exporting still, because the ports are still open, there are an awful lot of challenges in terms of workforce, getting the product or the produce from the farm to the processing facility. The trucks are just standing still by the road because the drivers have gone home. They've gone back to their villages. So another implication is that the Indian Spice Board is closed. So the Indian Spice Board test for aflatoxins for illegal dyes before any product is exported. So any batches, any consignments that have been tested can still be exported, but we'll be waiting on the Indian Spice Board opening, as well as all the internal supply chains working. So yes, just in time, it's vital for any food business that I've ever been involved with. But at the moment, we can anticipate the issues that are going to become of this, but we can't precisely predict what will happen in the medium and long term.
Okay, and it's good that you bring in the Indian example. We have people from right across the world working in corporate security, so I'm sure they'll appreciate that. Denis, I guess then, if we ask about, just in time, we could also ask about what real threats to food and necessitating food defense are we really seeing right now? Oh, Denis, I can't hear you.
My apologies. I was keeping quiet while others were speaking. So I share, Gideon's perspective. We've got factories. I was responsible for factories in India and Nigeria, across in the US and Pennsylvania. So we were subject to FSMA as well, of course. And the success of a business is fundamentally around, for me, is absolutely around cash flow. Cash flow is affected by working capital. And in order to mitigate or manage your working capital, you've got to have effective and efficient processes, which is where, my experience in continuous improvement comes in. And I genuinely believe, as Gideon and Daniel have just demonstrated, clear strategy, clear policies, an integrated supply chain, ideally vertical. So ideally, Daniel makes his own glass bottles, for example, together with an escalation and response process that enables you to react to any event, whether it's a Brexit event or the failure of one supplier of one material, or, to Gary's example, maybe you don't pass your FSMA audit, whatever it may be, right the way up to a global pandemic. As long as you've risk assessed what could go wrong and you've made a reasonable assessment of what actions you would take, you see there two examples of a very large and a reasonably medium-sized business both coping through this crisis because they're well structured, they've considered those risks, and they put those processes in place. So pandemics, issues, crises are when businesses are pressure tested, but more importantly, where the management and leadership and structures of those four things I described are pressure tested. Okay?
I like it.
So, that probably, if you're comfortable, that leads on to kind of the supply chain disruptions and what could be caused by such things as lockdowns, if that's okay. So we've already heard, change is when any business is at most vulnerability. It could be a global pandemic. It could be a change of supplier. It could be a new set of regulations, as Gary described with FSMA. It's new, it's different, it's novel. We need to think about it. We need to carefully prepare for it. We need to risk assess everything we do. Lockdown's going to impact labour, not just the number of people and lorry drivers in India. It's going to affect skills, competencies and capacity. It might affect our ability to raise invoices or collect payments, which affects cash flow. Then it doesn't really matter what you make. If you can't move your cash, you can't effectively operate as a business. The other thing as already been described again by Gideon, materials inbound. The wider the sourcing, the more you spread your sourcing network, the more challenging it is to maintain the integrity of it and to maintain the defense of it. And that's when you become more open to corruption, to adulteration, to those things which can affect your integrity of your supply chain. The other things are services. We forget about services. We buy services. Some manufacturers might buy steam, air, water, electricity, gas, whatever it may be. And if you haven't got control over that, then you haven't got control over your manufacturing processes. Routes to market. You might be able to make whatever you already did make, but you might not be able to get it to your market because it might be the other side of the world. And to be honest, when you've got an event like this, there's not much that remains unaffected. All of it gets affected, but it's the way you manage and deal with all those things.
Okay, at least it's positive. That's a positive message. We've had a lot of not so positive. Okay, so on my screen, if I ask you, Gary, because actually I know also in your company there's a lady who speaks a lot at our executive protection events. So I know your company deals with toxicology all the way through to corporate security. Gary, what sort of threats do you see on the horizon for food? And that can include, of course, physical attacks as well as tampering.
Right. Well, we kind of are aware of the traditional hazards, and of course, we design our food safety plans around those. Some of the unexpected ones that can happen are rare, And so we have to be careful to keep our eye on the important ones. We've had some instances this year that have affected globally customers, because we had very tough season last year in the United States with corn, weather affecting corn. So we've had recalls of product due to aflatoxin, mycotoxins, vomitoxin that has impacted our suppliers into global markets. So we're looking more closely at how weather is affecting a lot of these events, and being able to alert people that if you're growing, tomatoes in Florida, or romaine lettuce in Arizona, or cucumbers in Baja, Mexico, if there's been a weather event, it could increase the need to be careful and do some additional testing for pathogens. So we're trying to keep ahead of what is driving, what's the root cause of some of the events we've seen, and weather is one example. As Denis mentioned, or I think Denis mentioned, or no, the spice board issue was fascinating, because that's a good example of having a tight export control, maintaining the product quality. And that raises questions: to what degree does one need to establish a certificate of analysis retesting program and a test and hold program upon arrival? We have seen issues with salmonella in spices in the United States that have resulted in recalls when companies were not verifying COAs, but others did, and then reported that spice had salmonella to the FDA, which triggered a big recall for products that were produced in the absence of having some verification. So it is complicated, but I think the traditional risks are the big ones, but the untraditional ways they can be triggered is important.
And would that be through tampering, through malicious intent, whilst the eyes of the world are maybe elsewhere?
Well, the food defense, the intentional adulteration approach that FDA has taken has required companies to have food defense plans. If you're in an industry sector, let's say dairy, making a lot of cheese, odds are you're going to have an intentional adulteration prevention plan that takes into account that farm to table approach that includes malicious product tampering and that sort of thing. So we are working to get those programs in place, and there's a lot of guidance that is helping companies do that. I think the food fraud side is getting more and more attention. It may not be a food safety issue, but it's an economic adulteration issue that could have brand equity issues. And certainly in the seafood area, that is an issue. Also, we're getting more pressure about traceability. And sometimes people are saying traceability is equivalent to safety or equivalent to security, but it's just one piece of it. And often I say, traceability is a little bit like, closing the barn door after the horse is out. You've got to prevent it in the first place. Traceability can't put the horse back in the barn. So those are all elements, I think, of this food security, food defense platform that we're all trying to understand how best to do it. And there's, as Denis said, it's about money too. How much money do you have to invest? Where are you going to put that dollar? Is it on preventing contamination, or is it on some other aspect of your food safety plan? It's a tough job for people that have to make those financial decisions. Where do you put your dollar to protect the food that you're producing and your security, brand equity?
Do you mind if I build on that?
Yeah, please.
In terms of the adulteration and the counterfeiting, one of the things that we're considering in our risk assessments because of COVID is the poor quality of crop. So if crop is waiting at farm level, and it might be being sun dried for longer, degradation in colour. So does that increase the possibility of illegal dyes being implemented? We know at the moment, for example, the turmeric is just being pulled. It's not being boiled. It's just drying on the surface. Now, is that going to affect the aesthetic quality of the turmeric? Is that going to increase the temptation for the use of orange tea, for example? Now, it's purely financially driven. Now, we can all understand, because everybody's being financially affected by this, farmers who are living hand to mouth and they might only have small holdings, they do have a big incentive in order to make profit. A lot of the suppliers that we've approved, that we use, have backward integration right back to the farm. So they have agronomists that are out talking to the farmers all the time. Now, at the moment, that's not possible in many countries. So we're talking, we're talking about growers who might not know what to do in certain situations. We've seen locust outbreaks in northern India and Pakistan this year, and at the end of last year. So when these agricultural challenges occur, including the climate changes you were talking, we don't know how these farmers are going to respond and react. We don't know if they have the adequate resource in order to be able to deal with these issues. So it could be a quality issue that is causing a food safety issue, or an authenticity issue directly as a result of this COVID global pandemic. So these are all the things that we're considering. We know what has happened in the past, we know what's happening at the moment, and we can consider what may be happening in the future. And these are all the things that we're thinking about and we're considering. Now, we have to consider whether we are going to up our intake testing. So do we need to consider illegal dyes across more products? You know, chilies, for example, chili powders, paprikas. Do we need to be considering that more and taking a more representative sample from each batch at intake? There are so many things, there are so many unknowns usually within the ambient ingredient world, and this is fueling the fire of those unknowns. So we have to widen the scope of the possibilities. So,
well, Gideon, can I just say, do you think theft then will really accompany all these challenges? Because if they know you've got a genuine product, suddenly you might, have people stealing from you.
That would be considered as a threat to the supply chain. Now, I don't see an increased risk here in the UK of theft. Potentially in the supply chains, potentially at ports, because there are less staff there, less security there. So theft, yes, it's potential, but the way I see it, the way we've risk assessed it, I think that the counterfeiting and the adulteration is more of a risk than direct theft of product. The issue that we've got, it's not only that there are, the farmers are affected, and the processing facilities are affected, and the exports are affected. The demand here in the UK for our ingredients is significantly increased over the last few weeks. So we're being pulled one way and the other way as well. So there's an awful lot to consider in terms of maintaining the integrity of our supply chain.
Okay, fantastic. And
Ellen, if I could just build on that, if I may.
Yes, please, yes.
So I'm part of the IFST's COVID-19 planning team. So we're advising the government, the UK government, we're advising DEFRA. And I absolutely support Gideon's perspective on this, because it's not necessarily theft that's a concern. What is a concern is the fact that there's a huge demand in ambient food in the UK alone, because of the characteristic of panic buying and stockpiling. You know, some businesses are up 40 or 50% in terms of demand. Now, in order to maintain that, you need to maintain your supply chain. You need to maintain your inbound materials. So everybody is required to step up and play their part. You imagine the pressure on a supplier of, an ingredient when, the demand's going up all across the board. The temptation there to adulterate, maybe not because they've decided to operate suddenly without values, it's because they don't want to let their customers down. So the demand comes in, the solutions to meet that demand might push people's values, business values, to the very limit. That's the pressure test that I talked about. And when you've got a business that hasn't got a sound, robust business culture or food safety culture, then they would be tempted to drive an economically motivated adulteration. EMA, I think, is the term that the World Health Organization uses. So economically motivated to do something, not because they want to create more profit, but because they want to continue to supply. That's when the threat comes. And if you haven't got your integrated processes in place, you need to step in with different measures. As Gideon says, you increase your sampling and testing. You may move from being in a trusted state with your supplier. We trust you. You send your certificates of analysis and we believe what they're saying. You step into a new level. You don't want to be caught out. You don't want to be the person that's the business that's become a victim of this. So if you've got a good and well-structured 4 principles in place, then you can drive your own business agenda and ensure that if anyone's going to get adulterated materials, it's not going to be you, because you put the measures in place. And, you know, Daniel and Gideon have given great examples of why their particular businesses would be less vulnerable to that, because they've got controls in place. And as Gary said, you know, legislation and auditing also becomes affected during this. You can't necessarily do that. But the other thing that never goes away, and it creates an opportunity, is ideological adulteration. So it's not just the economic threat. Economic threats come further away from your core, that you extend your supply chain. What's closer to your core, what's close to the values that you exhibit as a business, what your brand says to the world about you, brings a greater ideological threat. And if the opportunity presents itself, then you're going to either get internal or external threats from an ideological perspective. Okay.
Fantastic.
Food defence is basically about considering that attack and managing yourself for it.
Well, I wanted to ask Daniel on the cyber side, but can I throw in a couple of questions from the audience into the mix, as it were? We've got Athman, who is from Kenya, and he wants to know about your perspective on how African countries that require aid, that simultaneously are suppliers, how that's going to affect it. And if we can bundle in, we've got another question from Lee off the back of the previous question. Do we see drones technology thrusting forward at a quicker rate to support operations? In fact, Steve England has another question which isn't quite off the back of that, but it asks about the process to stop checking becoming the potential target for hijack to manipulate data. Tell you what, because we've got three kind of different questions. Could I ask Gideon, do you see the adoption of drones and other technology to speed things up? Maybe that's a good place to start with these questions.
I see that drones can be very helpful for agriculture when we're looking at crops on a wide scale. Potentially, whether it's in small scale agriculture with cooperatives in any country, whether it's difficult access, but to look at crop quality and harvest indicators, then definitely. It depends where your moral compass sits, whether you think that reducing labour in the fields is a positive thing or not. But I certainly think that yes, it could be. Now, personally, I don't know enough about drones to be able to comment on where else they may be useful in the supply chain. I think that we could use technology more in terms of food defence right along the supply chain. If you look at fresh produce, looking at temperature monitoring, looking at gas concentrations right through the supply chains and all the reefer containers, we know the technology's there. We know the technology works. Now, if we can implement more GPS, more small-scale security on our pallets, or in our containers, then yes, I'm definitely a supporter of that. Using technology for the benefit of food safety is always going to get a thumbs up.
Fantastic. Does anyone have a thought on the countries that require aid but yet export stuff to us, or is that for a different panel? Anybody want to take that?
Obviously, I was responsible for factories in India and in Nigeria, and those, depending on the economic impact across any supply chain, can depend upon the variability of supply. So we were subject to, in some cases, dramatic changes to our ability to supply, not just in terms of economic impact from countries like Nigeria. Perhaps, there's a change of government and there suddenly becomes a change of policy. So overnight, we were not able to import palm oil from anywhere else in the world other than Nigeria. We had to use indigenous palm oil supplies, which would have conflicted our sustainability credentials as a business. The king of Saudi Arabia decides that you can only buy flour from his mills. They're effects that can have a dramatic place in that supply chain. But I would also add to Gideon's point that Tesco, who are one of the biggest, well, in fact, the biggest retail business in the UK, have just completed their first virtual audit of a manufacturing site. So technology, I think events like this drive us towards the technology that we've been giving ourselves reasons and excuses not to use in the past. So I think this will not only give us the reason to think differently and think spectacularly differently. And I did answer a question earlier from a guy called Andrew, who was asking, you know, do we think this will change the supply chain? I think most definitely the way we think, the way we conduct ourselves, the way we do business, the way we evaluate. People are playing around with blockchain. Suddenly, blockchain may become a real solution to all of these things, and that's across countries with aid challenges. That's across countries with labour challenges and economic migration and all of those things.
Okay. Well, conscious of time, maybe I just haven't given this panel enough time. It seems such a juicy debate. Daniel, could you quickly just tell us about cyber threats? I know it's a very superficial question, but since it's your thing. Oh, we can't hear you.
Sorry. I actually wanted to come back to Gideon's point briefly. We were talking about the reputation and things like that. You know, I mean, Graham's Family Dairy, we're a very strong brand. We're all about the brand and the quality, as our Bart, but in that fresh contingency, that fresh products area. Now we did a product for one of the large supermarkets, an own brand product that was Hebridean sea salt butter, so crystals of Hebridean sea salt and butter. But again, what happened was that the company we were purchasing the sea salt from, they were having financial difficulties that we weren't aware of, and they suddenly discovered that it wasn't us that discovered it, but another supplier discovered it wasn't Hebridean sea salt they were putting into it. They were just buying the cheapest salt they could find, turning into crystals and reselling that. And
that was a whistleblower, internal whistleblower. That was.
Was it? Were you aware of that one? Yes.
Yeah.
So they were one of our suppliers, and that causes a big issue. So how as a medium-sized business like us can we have to trust them? Like you say, you've got to build up that trust, and when that's betrayed, that's really, really bad. But from a cybersecurity point of view, the current crisis, we've seen an increase in cyber threats. But nothing new, just a general increase in volume. So there's, I don't feel that specific food defense needs to be affected by cyber, not at our level anyway. And the question you had on the Q&A there about what's to stop people changing that data, you look at the horse meat scandal and things like that. It all comes down to auditing and trust again. I mean, if you're being audited by a supermarket, and Gideon will know that we get audited all the time by every supermarket, every organic body, every goodness knows who, and the vegetarian society, luckily not the vegan society for us. But these guys keep you on your toes, and they're going through asking for logs. At the moment, they're not asking for data logs. They're not asking to prove that your records in your database are correct. They just accept that they are. But I think that's coming. I think that is coming. Okay,
and I tell you what, because we're really over time. Gary, you can have the final word. What's the near future hold then?
Well, I think this discussion's been fantastic. I've learned a lot from this, and I think it reinforces the need to continue this dialogue about supply chains, about risk, about certificates of analysis, what level of testing is associated with trust. I think the issues about our global supply chains, as Denis said, will be changed and altered by this. I think that we're going to continue to find ways of using blockchain to address issues that could be linked to food fraud, because that seems to be a way to prevent some of that. Traceability won't prevent things. I'm a heavy emphasis person on prevention, first and foremost, and loss control for companies, reducing brand equity risk. And so I'm continuing to have that as be our focus to help companies achieve that through whatever means. They have whatever auditing scheme they have, helping them analyze where their weak links are. And so this has been helpful to me, and I hope to others that are listening.